If you trace the supply chains of the modern global economy, the smartphones, electric vehicles, and financial reserves, they lead back to the same starting point. Africa functions as the industrial core of the 21st century. This map tracks the raw physical wealth of the continent. Africa holds 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land and roughly 30% of global mineral reserves. In the Democratic Republic of Congo alone, untapped resource wealth is estimated at over $24 trillion. Overlapping this immense wealth is an external debt burden exceeding $1.1 trillion. This financial weight consistently anchors the continent at the bottom of the Human Development Index. While the mainstream economic conversation often centers on Western aid, the data shows Africa is a net creditor to the global financial system. More total capital flows out of the continent every year than enters it. The consistency of this disparity across multiple decades and regions suggests we are looking at the predictable outcomes of a specific structural design. Understanding this requires an examination of three specific policy levers. First, monetary control. Second, macroeconomic conditionality, and value chain extraction. By looking past the traditional framing of international charity, we can analyze the mechanics of this extraction machine. The first pillar is monetary control. This highlighted region represents 14 sovereign African nations and roughly 180 million people who still operate under the CFA Franc, a currency system established in 1945. The defining mechanic of this system is a legal requirement to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves outside the continent. This capital flows directly across the Mediterranean, removing liquidity that would otherwise be available for domestic infrastructural investment. Those reserves are legally held right here, inside the French Treasury in Paris. For millions of citizens conducting daily business, the primary medium of exchange is a currency guaranteed and managed by a foreign power. The system also enforces a fixed exchange rate pegged to the euro. That rate is determined in Europe. Because the exchange rate is fixed externally, African governments cannot devalue their own currency. They are blocked from using the primary monetary tool required to make their manufacturing and agricultural exports competitive on the global market. At independence in 1958, Guinean leader Sékou Touré became the sole francophone head of state to reject this system and demand a sovereign currency. The response was immediate. France withdrew its administrators overnight and destroyed administrative records and physical infrastructure. The severity of the pullout served as a warning to any other nation attempting financial independence. The CFA Franc demonstrates that a nation can design a flag and write its own constitution while remaining legally tethered to its former colonizer through its money supply. After independence, African nations faced a massive capital deficit. Colonial administrations had largely built infrastructure designed for extraction, railways and roads leading to ports, rather than connecting internal cities, leaving the new states with limited industrial capacity. To build schools and hospitals, these governments turned to the Bretton Woods institutions, primarily the World Bank. They also turned to its sister organization, the International Monetary Fund, for massive capital loans. In the 1980s and 90s, these institutions issued loans through structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. Accessing this capital required accepting a list of non-negotiable macroeconomic conditionalities. This diagram outlines the core SAP mandates. To access capital, African governments had to privatize state enterprises, cut subsidies, and prematurely liberalize trade. By eliminating subsidies, the IMF dismantled protective barriers around African industries, leaving them entirely exposed. While Africa was required to cut domestic support, the US and Europe massively subsidized their own agricultural sectors. Heavily subsidized Western crops flooded these newly opened markets. Local African farmers found it impossible to compete on price with imported food. The resulting economic data is overwhelmingly clear. Nations like Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana that were actively building manufacturing capacity in the 1970s experienced widespread deindustrialization over the next 2 decades. African leaders who tried to build self-sufficient economies and reject these mandated frameworks, like Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, were routinely overthrown or assassinated. SAPs effectively reconfigured African economies into open, defenseless markets for Western surpluses. This extraction continues today. The celebrated green energy transition relies on the same architecture as the fossil fuel era. Consider this supply chain model. The Democratic Republic of Congo currently supplies over 70% of the global cobalt required for lithium-ion electric vehicle batteries. The physical resource is extracted in Africa, but the value-added processing and manufacturing occur in European and Asian hubs. Mining corporations protect margins using transfer pricing. Through shell companies, they separate resource extraction from where profits are booked. While physical cobalt moves to manufacturing centers, financial profits are routed through tax havens, completely bypassing the African tax base. While the profits are exported, the financial liabilities remain through the legal doctrine of odious debt. During the Cold War, dictators like Mobutu Sese Seko took billions in foreign loans, funneling the capital into private Swiss bank accounts rather than domestic infrastructure. When those regimes collapse, the multi-billion-dollar debt service is inherited by the citizens, while the stolen money remains in the foreign banks where it was deposited. This Sankey diagram measures the continent's macroeconomic balance sheet. On the left, money flows in through foreign aid and investment. On the right, money flows out through debt servicing, tax avoidance, and repatriated profits. When aggregated, the structural outflow outweighs the inflow. The global economy functions on the mathematical assumption that African resources exist to subsidize the rest of the world's consumption. Africa's poverty is the mathematically guaranteed output of this triad. Monetary subordination, macroeconomic conditionality, and value chain extraction work together to ensure the wealth generated on the continent does not stay there. Economists often point to the Asian tigers, asking why South Korea and Singapore developed, while African nations did not. The historical record shows those nations industrialized, using state protectionism and capital controls, the exact policies that were banned in Africa. Reversing this deficit requires dismantling the architecture. It means exiting the CFA currency zone and enforcing strict transfer pricing laws at the point of extraction. That requires immense Pan-African coordination. Frameworks like the African Continental Free Trade Area are currently being implemented to redirect trade inward, connecting domestic raw materials with domestic industrial capacity. The historical record shows a continent consistently generating immense wealth, which is then siphoned off through a series of global financial locks. Reclaiming that wealth is a matter of dismantling a global architecture built to exploit it.